On a cold Tuesday morning in the spring of 1815, the County Herald printed an advertisement that people would talk about for 50 years. It read, "For sale at Ravenscourt Estate, 1 iron plow, good condition, 1 milk cow, 4 years old, gentle temper, the services of 1 female, plain, obedient, accustomed to hard work, inquiries to His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscourt." The female had a name, though the newspaper did not print it. Her name was Charlotte Hale. She was 24 years old, and she read the advertisement standing in the kitchen of the very house that was selling her, while the cook looked away and the scullery maid began to cry. By the end of that week, 340 letters had arrived at Ravenscourt. Not one of them asked about the plow. Not one of them asked about the cow. And when the first carriage came up the drive, bearing the golden crest of one of the most powerful men in England, the Duke of Ravenscourt would begin to understand that he had made the greatest mistake of his life. But to understand that morning, we must go back 3 months, to the night the old Duke died and everything changed. Charlotte Hale had lived at Ravenscourt for 11 years, and in all that time, she had never once sat at the dining table. She had stood beside it, she had served at it, she had cleared it, polished it, and repaired the scratch on its leg where a careless footman had dragged a chair, but she had never sat at it, not even on Christmas. This was strange because Charlotte was not a servant, at least not officially. She was, as the old Duke used to say, family in a manner of speaking. Her mother had been a distant cousin of the Duke's late wife. When Charlotte was orphaned at 13, the old Duke had taken her in. He gave her a small room on the 3rd floor, a place in the household, and when no one else was listening, something far more valuable, his kindness. He was the one who let her use the library. He was the one who noticed she could read French by 15 and Latin by 17. And once, at a dinner party 2 years ago, when a guest asked who the quiet girl by the sideboard was, the old Duke had put down his glass, looked around the table, and said something no one in that room ever forgot. That is Charlotte Hale, and I will tell you this. There is more noble blood standing beside that sideboard than sitting at this table. The guests had laughed uneasily, thinking it a joke. One person had not laughed at all. Lady Diana Fenwick, seated at the old Duke's left, had gone very still, and her eyes had moved to Charlotte with the slow, patient attention of a cat noticing a bird. Diana was beautiful, wealthy, and engaged to the old Duke's nephew and heir, Nathaniel. And from that evening on, she hated Charlotte Hale with a quiet, careful, well-dressed hatred, the most dangerous kind there is. Then 3 months ago, the old Duke died in his sleep. Charlotte was the one who found him. She was the one who closed his eyes, and she was the only person in the house who wept for the man rather than for the will. The new Duke arrived a week after the funeral. Nathaniel was 31, tall, dark-haired, and handsome in the cold way that a winter morning is handsome. He had spent years in London, and London had not been kind to him. The gambling debts came with him like luggage. So did Lady Diana. He walked through Ravenscourt on that first day with a ledger in his hand, and Charlotte watched him put a price on everything he passed. The paintings, the silver, the horses. When his eyes finally reached her, standing in the hall with her hands folded, he frowned slightly, the way a man frowns at a piece of furniture he does not remember buying. "And this is," he asked. "Charlotte Hale, Your Grace," said Mr. Godwin, the old butler, "a relation of the late Duchess. The late Duke was her guardian." A relation. The new Duke looked at her plain gray dress, her worn shoes. A relation who costs how much a year? He did not ask her name again. From that day, Charlotte was given the work of 2 maids and the wages of none. She did not complain. She had learned long ago that complaints were a luxury, like sugar, and she had lived without both before. But Diana was not satisfied with silence. Diana wanted Charlotte gone. The chance came on a Thursday evening in March, at the first dinner party the new Duke hosted at Ravenscourt. 12 guests. Charlotte was serving. Halfway through dinner, Diana turned to an elderly guest, Colonel Ashworth, and said sweetly, "Of course, Colonel, you know what they say about the late Duke's final years. His mind was quite gone at the end. He hardly knew his own name, poor soul. Half the things he said meant nothing at all. It was a small poison, carefully placed. If the old Duke had been mad, then everything he had ever said about Charlotte meant nothing too." The Colonel frowned. "Is that so? I dined with him last autumn and found him sharp as a blade." "Oh, he had his good days," Diana said smoothly. "But by winter, I am told, he could not even remember which year it was." And that was when Charlotte, standing at the sideboard with a serving dish in her hands, spoke without raising her voice. "On the 9th of December, my lady, His Grace corrected the vicar's Latin during the evening reading, recited the reign dates of every king since the conquest to entertain Dr. Merton, and beat Mr. Godwin at chess in under an hour. I believe he knew which year it was." The table went silent. Colonel Ashworth put back his head and laughed, a great warm laugh, and lifted his glass. "There, by God, that is the Duke I knew. Thank you, my dear." Several guests smiled. Someone murmured, "Well said." Diana smiled too. Diana smiled beautifully, while her hand closed around her napkin so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Across the table, the new Duke looked at Charlotte for a moment with an expression she could not read, something almost like surprise, and then it was gone, and he turned back to his wine. Charlotte finished serving and left the room. Her heart was beating hard. She knew what she had done. She had made herself visible, and at Ravenscourt, under its new masters, being visible was dangerous. She did not know how dangerous until later that night. It was past midnight when the messenger came from London. Charlotte was still awake, mending linens by candlelight, when she heard the front door, then raised voices from the study. Through the half-open door, as she passed in the corridor, she saw the new Duke standing by the fire with a letter in his hand, and his face was the color of ash. 11,000, he said. "They are calling in £11,000 by summer." And Diana's voice, low and soothing. "Then we sell. The estate is full of things you do not need. Darling, sit down, drink this. I have already had Godwin draw up a list for the county sale. Old equipment, spare livestock, useless things. You need only sign it and I will handle everything. You should not have to trouble yourself with trivial matters. Not tonight." A pause, the sound of paper on the desk, the scratch of a pen. Charlotte walked on. Estate sales were common enough. It was nothing to do with her. She could not see what Diana had done at the desk in the moment before she carried the list to the Duke. She could not see the ink still wet on one added line, written in a careful copy of the estate steward's plain hand, slipped in neatly between the iron plow and the milk cow. The new Duke signed his name at the bottom without reading a single word. He was staring into the fire, seeing £11,000 and the end of everything his family had ever owned. Diana folded the list and smiled and kissed him good night. 4 days later, the County Herald came out, and by 9 o'clock that morning, the scullery maid was crying in the kitchen. The cook could not meet anyone's eyes, and Charlotte Hale stood by the window with the newspaper in her hands, reading her own life listed for sale between a plow and a cow. She read it twice. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears, like complaints, were a luxury. But her hands trembled as she folded the newspaper, and in the servants' hall, in the village, in every parlor in the county, people were already talking, and the talk was spreading faster than any fire. What no one knew yet, not Charlotte, not Diana, not the Duke himself, was that 90 miles away in London, an old gentleman with silver hair was about to open that same newspaper at his breakfast table. He would read the advertisement 3 times. He would put down his coffee with a shaking hand. And then the Earl of Marlow, one of the 12 most powerful men in England, would stand up so quickly that his chair fell over, and shout for his carriage, and say a name out loud that he had been searching for 23 years. "Hail," he would whisper, "merciful God, hail." But that is the next part of the story. The first thing Charlotte did was pack. She owned very little: one spare dress, her mother's Bible, a wooden box containing a few letters, a dried flower, and a small portrait of a man in an officer's uniform, a man with kind eyes and her same stubborn chin. Her father, Captain Edward Hale, who had died in the war when she was barely more than a baby. She had no memory of his voice. She knew him only from this painted face, small enough to fit in her two hands. She packed it all in 20 minutes, 11 years of her life, and it fit into one small trunk. She did not know where she would go. She only knew she could not stay in a house that had printed her in a newspaper between farm equipment and livestock. There were things a person could survive, and things a person should not agree to survive. Charlotte had spent her whole life learning the difference. But when she carried her trunk down the back stairs, Mr. Godwin was standing at the bottom, and the old butler did something he had never done in 40 years of service. He blocked the way. "Miss Hale," he said quietly, "I beg you wait 3 days." "Mr. Godwin, you read the newspaper." "I did." Something moved in the old man's face, something between shame and anger. "And I am telling you, as someone who served this family since before you were born, wait 3 days. If you walk out that door now, walk out with your head high in front of the whole county, not like a thief in the morning. You have done nothing wrong. Do not leave like someone who has." It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make. And because she trusted him, and because she truly had nowhere to go, Charlotte carried her trunk back up the stairs. She would thank God for that old man every day for the rest of her life. Because the letters had already begun to arrive. The first 3 came on Friday in the afternoon post. The Duke was out riding. Diana took the letters, saw the seals, and frowned. Heavy paper, expensive wax, crests she recognized, one of them from a family so old and so grand that her own father had never once been invited to their table. She opened one, she read it, and she stopped understanding the world. The letter was short, cold, and correct. It inquired in the politest language imaginable about the third item in the advertisement in the County Herald, the female. It requested her full name, her age, her parentage, and it was signed by a marquis. The second letter asked the same, so did the third. "It is a joke," Diana said to the empty room. "Someone is mocking him, that is all." On Saturday, 11 more letters came. On Monday, 40. By Wednesday, the post boy was carrying a sack instead of a bag, and he looked frightened, and the letters had begun to change. They were no longer polite inquiries. Some demanded answers. One, from a viscount in Kent, contained a single sentence that Diana read 4 times without breathing. "If the woman named in your advertisement is who I believe she is, then you had better pray to God, sir, that she has not been harmed in your house." Diana burned that one in her bedroom fireplace. But she could not burn them all. The Duke had begun to notice. Anyone would have noticed. 340 letters in 6 days, and not one of them, not a single one, asked about the plow or the cow. "What is this?" the Duke said on Thursday morning, standing in his study before a desk buried in paper. "What in God's name is this? Who is this woman?" He said this woman because the truth was he did not know. He had signed a sale list he never read. He had seen the advertisement only when the whole county was already talking, and he had assumed, the way a busy man assumes, that his steward had listed some village laborer, some washerwoman, some stranger. The thought that it might be the quiet gray-eyed girl from his own hallway, the one who had defended his uncle's memory at dinner, had truly not occurred to him. It occurred to him now. "Godwin," he said slowly, "the woman in the advertisement, who is she?" The old butler stood very straight, looked his master in the eye, and said, "Miss Charlotte Hale, your grace, the late Duke's ward. She is currently in the East Corridor, polishing the silver you plan to sell." The Duke went very still, and Diana, standing by the window, watched his face and began, for the first time, to be afraid. "Send her to me," the Duke said. "There is no need," said a voice from the doorway. Charlotte stood there with the silver polish still on her apron. She had heard her own name through the open door, and she had decided, once and for all, that she was finished being discussed as if she were not in the room. "You wish to know who I am, Your Grace. I am the woman you are selling. I would curtsy, but I understand the Plow does not curtsy either, and I should hate to give myself airs above my station in the catalogue." The silence in that study was absolute. And into that silence, from the open window, came the sound of wheels on gravel. A carriage was coming up the long drive. Not a farmer's cart, not a county squire's gig. A carriage of midnight blue lacquer with 4 black horses, moving fast, and on its door shone a golden crest that Mr. Godwin recognized from 30 paces, because that crest sat above one of the oldest names in England. "Your Grace," the butler said, and his voice was strange, "the Earl of Marlow is here." The Earl of Marlow was 71 years old. He had buried 2 kings, advised 3 prime ministers, and it was said in London that half the House of Lords owed him money and the other half owed him favors. He did not visit. People visited him. Yet here he was, climbing down from his carriage before it had fully stopped, refusing his footman's arm and walking toward the house with the speed of a man 50 years younger. The Duke went out to receive him. Diana followed, smoothing her dress, already assembling her most beautiful smile. The Earl walked past the Duke's outstretched hand, as if it were a hat stand. He walked past Diana as if she were not there at all. He stopped in the doorway of the study, where Charlotte stood frozen with polish on her apron, and no idea in the world what was happening. The old man looked at her face the way a man looks at a sunrise after a long illness. His eyes went over her gray eyes, her stubborn chin, and they filled unmistakably with tears. "Merciful God," the Earl of Marlow said softly, "you have his face." And then before the Duke of Ravenscourt, before Lady Diana Fenwick, before Mr. Godwin and 2 footmen and a housemaid who dropped an entire tray, one of the 12 most powerful men in England removed his hat and bowed to the girl in the stained apron. Not a nod, not a polite inclination. A full, deep, formal bow, the kind reserved for royalty. "Miss Hale," he said, "my name is Marlow. I have been searching for you for 23 years, and I have come to tell you that you are, without any exception I can think of, the most protected woman in England." He straightened and turned, and looked at the Duke of Ravenscourt. And his eyes were no longer full of tears. They were full of something else entirely. "And you, sir," the Earl said quietly, "are going to explain to me, and to 11 other men who are perhaps a day behind me on the road, exactly what this newspaper means." They gathered in the great drawing room, because the Earl of Marlow refused to speak in the study. "What I have to say," he told them, "will be said in the finest room in this house, because it concerns the finest man I ever knew." So the fires were lit and chairs were brought, and Charlotte sat, for the first time in 11 years, in the center of a room at Ravenscourt while other people stood. The Duke stood by the fireplace. Diana perched on the edge of a sofa, her smile fastened on like a brooch. And the old Earl sat across from Charlotte, leaned forward, and asked his first question in a gentle voice. "My dear, what do you know of your father?" "Very little, my lord. He was a captain of infantry. He died in the war in Spain when I was 1 year old. My mother said he was kind. She died when I was 13, and after that there was no one left to ask." The Earl nodded slowly. "And no one ever came, no one ever told you what he did?" "What he did, my lord." The old man was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was the voice of a man opening a door he had kept closed for a long time. In the winter of the war's worst year, there was a retreat through the mountains of Spain. I will not describe it to you, because some things should not be described to a lady, and because I still see it when I close my eyes. It is enough to say that the rear guard was cut off. 200 men, trapped in a frozen pass with the enemy on the heights above them. Among those 200 were some of the most foolish, arrogant, useless young officers England ever produced. Rich men's sons who had bought their commissions and thought war was a fox hunt. I know this, the Earl said, because one of them was my son, and another was me. I was 50 years old and a colonel, and I had no business being in those mountains, and I was dying of a wound in my side. No one in the room moved. The man who commanded the rear guard was a captain of no fortune and no family. The other officers had laughed at him for a year. He had no valet, one horse, and an accent from a grammar school instead of a great one. His name was Edward Hale. Charlotte's hands closed slowly in her lap. Captain Hale held that pass for 6 days, the Earl said. When the ammunition was gone, he held it with bayonets. When the food was gone, he gave his own share to the wounded, and I know that because I was one of the wounded and I remember his hands putting biscuit into mine. And when the relief column finally broke through and there was a mile of open ground under enemy fire between us and safety, Captain Hale carried men across it, on his back, one at a time, men who had laughed at him. He crossed that mile 11 times. The old man's voice did not break, but it came very close. There is no soldier in Europe who would have blamed him for stopping. He went back a 12th time for a 19-year-old lieutenant with a shattered leg who was screaming for his mother. He carried that boy all the way across, set him down safely behind the wall, and then he sat down beside him, very quietly, as if he were tired. He had been shot twice on the crossing and had told no one. He died within the hour, sitting in the sun, with the boy's hand in his. Somewhere in the room, a housemaid was weeping openly. Mr. Godwin stood by the door with his eyes shining and his chin trembling. 12 of us lived because of him, the Earl said. 12. Every one of us came home and inherited our father's titles and our father's fortunes, and we swore an oath together in a field hospital in Portugal, with our hands on a Bible that I keep to this day in a glass case in my library. We swore that Edward Hale's family would never want for anything as long as one of us drew breath. We knew he had a wife and a baby daughter. When we came home, we searched. But your mother, my dear, was a proud woman, and I think she had seen how the army treated her husband and wanted nothing from great men. She had moved, left no address, taken work under her maiden name. We hired men to look. For years, twice we came close. Then we heard she had died and the child had gone to relatives and the trail went cold. 23 years, Miss Hale. Some of the 12 told me to give it up. I never did. I told them, we will find Hale's daughter when God decides we deserve to. The old man reached into his coat and took out a folded newspaper, worn soft from handling. And then last Tuesday at my breakfast table I opened the County Herald, and I found the daughter of the bravest man I ever knew listed for sale. His voice dropped to nearly nothing, between a plow and a milk cow. The silence that followed was the most dangerous silence Ravenscourt had ever held. I wrote to the others before my coffee went cold, the Earl said. 11 letters, and I will tell you what I wrote because I am too old to be delicate. I wrote, found, Ravenscourt, come. He looked up and his gaze went at last to the Duke of Ravenscourt, who stood by the fireplace with a face like a man watching his own house burn. They are coming, sir, the Duke of Weston, the Marquis of Ashford, Lord Renfield, whose bank, I believe, holds a number of your notes, all of them. Some are on the road as we speak, and every single one of them has read your advertisement. My lord, the Duke began, I must tell you that I never. You will have your chance to speak, the Earl said, without raising his voice, and the Duke fell silent, because there are men who can silence a Duke, and this was one of them. But not to me alone. You will speak to all 12 of us. That is the oath's right, and we have waited 23 years to exercise it. Then the old man turned back to Charlotte, and his whole face changed, the way winter changes when the sun comes out. My dear child, you have a home in London if you want it. You have 12 homes. You have men who will present you at court, dower you like a princess, and horsewhip anyone who so much as looks at you unkindly. Not as charity, never as charity, as a debt. We have owed your father 23 years of interest, and we intend to pay every penny of it." Charlotte had not spoken in a long time. She was looking down at her own hands, rough from silver polish and laundry soap, and when she finally raised her head, her eyes were wet but her voice was steady. "My lord, may I ask one question?" "Anything." "The lieutenant, the 19-year-old boy, the 12th man, the one my father went back for," she swallowed. "Did he live?" The Earl of Marlow smiled, and it was the saddest and warmest smile in the world. "He lived, my dear. He grew up to be the finest of us all, and when my letter reached him 4 days ago, he was in Scotland, 500 miles away." The old man glanced toward the window, toward the long drive stretching north. He wrote back one line. He wrote, "I am already on the road. Tell her the 12th man is coming to kneel." And far away, at that very hour on a rain-swept northern road, a mud-splattered carriage was changing horses at a coaching inn while its owner paced the yard, refusing food, refusing rest, telling the ostlers to hurry, hurry, for the love of God, hurry. He was a man of 50 now, silver at the temples, and he had waited 23 years to repay a debt that could never be repaid. He was also, though Charlotte could not know it yet, the one man in England whose arrival would change not only her future, but the Duke's and Diana's, and the fate of Ravenscourt itself. But that is the next part of the story. They came for 3 days. Carriage after carriage rolled up the long drive of Ravenscourt, each one grander than the last, until the stable yard looked like the courtyard of a palace. The Duke of Weston came, a mountain of a man with a voice like distant cannon. The Marquis of Ashford came, thin and precise, a man who was said to read bank ledgers the way other men read poetry. Lord Renfield came, and when he stepped down from his carriage, he looked up at the house with the small, cold smile of a banker looking at something he already owned. 11 men, 11 of the most powerful names in England, gathered under one roof, and not one of them had come to see the Duke. They came to see Charlotte. And each meeting was the same, and each one was different. Old men with medals, younger men with their fathers' faces. One by one they were presented to her in the drawing room, and one by one, these men who bowed to no one below the king bowed to the daughter of Captain Edward Hale. The Duke of Weston held both her hands in his enormous ones and could not speak at all for a full minute. The Marquis of Ashford, the coldest man in London, presented her with a small velvet box, and inside was a brass uniform button, polished like gold. "Your father's, Miss Hale. It came off in my hand as he carried me. I have kept it on my desk for 23 years. I find I make fewer dishonorable decisions with it watching me." But it was the 12th man everyone was waiting for. He arrived on the 3rd evening in the rain, in a carriage so mud-covered that no crest could be seen. He had crossed 500 miles in 6 days. He came through the front doors of Ravenscourt still in his traveling coat, soaked to the knees, a tall, silver-templed man of 50, and the whole hall went silent because the other 11 lords had come out to the staircase to watch, and some of them were already removing their hats. His name was Lord Julian Weymouth. He had been 19 years old in a frozen mountain pass, screaming for his mother with a shattered leg, when a quiet captain came back across a mile of open ground for the 12th time. He saw Charlotte at the foot of the stairs. He crossed the hall to her without a word, and then in front of 11 lords, the entire staff of Ravenscourt, the Duke and Lady Diana Fenwick, Lord Julian Weymouth, owner of half of Northumberland, went down on both knees on the marble floor, took the hem of Charlotte's plain grey dress in his hands, and pressed it to his lips. "I have rehearsed this moment for 23 years, he said, and his voice was ruined. "And I find I remember none of my speech. Miss Hale, Your father's last act on this earth was to carry me. His last words were to me. He said, 'Be still now, lad, you are going home.'" He looked up at her, and this man of 50 was, for a moment, 19 again. "I am the reason you grew up without a father, and I have come to spend the rest of my life making that right." Charlotte, who had not wept when she read the advertisement, who had not wept in 11 years of cold rooms and colder words, wept now. She took his hands and made him rise, and could not speak, and did not need to. There was not a dry eye on that staircase, except two. Diana stood at the edge of the hall, watching her whole world tilt, calculating and recalculating and finding no sum that saved her. And the Duke of Ravenscourt stood alone in the doorway of his own study, watching a scene of love and honor in his own house, and understanding with perfect clarity that he was not part of it, and never would be. The reckoning came the next morning. They did not shout. That was the terrible thing, Charlotte thought afterward. 12 men sat along one side of the great dining table like a court-martial, and the Duke stood alone on the other side, and they were very, very quiet. "You will explain the advertisement," said the Duke of Weston. "I cannot," the Duke said. "I signed the sale list without reading it. That is the truth, and it is also unforgivable, and I know how it sounds. I did not write those words. I do not know how they came to be there. But the signature is mine, the house is mine, and the fault is mine. I will not stand here and blame a steward or a servant to save myself." For one heartbeat, his eyes moved to Diana, who stood pale by the window. And then he looked away and said nothing more. He would not accuse a woman without proof, not even to save his own name. It was the one piece of his honor he had left, and it was the one piece that would cost him everything. "Then you confess it," said Lord Renfield softly, and opened a leather folder. "Very well, let us speak of accounts. Your Grace holds notes with my bank in the amount of £11,000 due at summer. I am calling them due now. Ashford, I believe you hold his paper as well." "4,000, said the Marquis without emotion. "Gentlemen," said old Marlowe, and his voice was heavy, "understand what is happening here. It is not revenge. It is arithmetic. You put a price on Hale's daughter in a public newspaper. England will now put a price on you. Every door in London has already closed. Every invitation has already been burned. You will find no credit, no partners, no friends, and no mercy because you showed none. Ravenscourt itself will go to auction before autumn, and you, sir, will be remembered for one advertisement forever." The Duke stood very straight through all of it. When they finished, he said only one thing. "May I ask a single favor, not for myself?" "Ask," said Marlowe. "The staff of this house have done nothing wrong. Mr. Godwin has served this family for 40 years. When the estate is sold, I ask that they be placed with references at your houses. That is all." The 12 lords looked at him, and some of them frowned slightly, the way men frown at a sum that does not come out even. It was not the request of the monster they had come to ruin. But arithmetic is arithmetic. The sentence stood. Charlotte left Ravenscourt 2 days later in the Earl of Marlowe's own carriage, wearing a new traveling dress that had appeared in her room like something from a fairy tale. The whole staff lined the steps to see her off. The scullery maid cried again. The cook pressed a parcel of seed cake into her hands as if she were sending a daughter to sea. And at the very end of the line stood Mr. Godwin. The old butler helped her into the carriage, and then, holding the door, he leaned in and spoke very quietly and very fast, the words of a man who has argued with his conscience all night and lost. "Hale, before you go, there is something you should know. The morning the newspaper came out, before you were even awake, His Grace called for his horse. He rode into the village alone. He went to the printers and then to every shop, and he tried to buy them, all of them, every copy of the Herald in the town with his own money out of his own pocket." The old man's eyes searched her face. "He was 1 hour too late. The post coaches had already gone out. I only know because the printer's boy told my nephew. His Grace has never spoken of it to a living soul." Charlotte sat very still. Mr. Godwin, why would he try to buy them if he wrote it? That, Miss Hale, the old butler said, closing the carriage door with great gentleness, is a question I have been asking myself for 3 weeks, and I do not like any of my answers. The carriage rolled down the long drive. Charlotte looked back once. The Duke of Ravenscourt was not at the windows. He was standing alone at the far edge of the garden by the old sundial with his back to the house, watching the carriage go, and he stood there, Mr. Godwin said later, until it was long out of sight, and then a while more. 90 miles ahead lay London, and a season of silk and candlelight, and a future so bright it did not seem real. But behind her in the emptying house, in a locked drawer of a dead man's desk that no one had yet opened, lay a folded paper with a wax seal, waiting in the dark. And it had her name on it. London took one look at Charlotte Hale and lost its mind. The story had arrived before she did. By the time the Earl of Marlowe's carriage reached his great house on Grosvenor Square, every drawing room in the city was telling it. The hero's daughter, the lost girl, the advertisement, the 12 lords. Within a week, the papers had given her a name that stuck. The heroine of England, they called her, though she had done nothing, she said, but survive. You are wrong, my dear, old Marlowe told her over breakfast. Surviving with your kindness intact is the rarest heroism there is. I have known generals who could not manage it. She was presented at court. The old queen, who had lost a son of her own in the wars, held Charlotte's hand a long moment and said quietly, "Your father was owed this," and after that no door in England was closed to her. The 12 lords settled a dowry on her that made the newspapers gasp. Modistes begged to dress her. Painters begged to paint her. At her first ball, so many gentlemen requested introductions that the line, one wit reported, stretched past the card room. And Charlotte moved through all of it with a small, careful distance in her eyes. Like a woman walking through a beautiful dream she did not entirely trust. She learned to dance without counting under her breath. She learned that oysters were eaten with a small fork and compliments with a smaller smile. But some things she refused to learn. She still rose at 6. She still knew the name of every servant in the Marlowe house within a fortnight, and their children's names within 2. When a footman dropped a full tray of glasses at a dinner party and the table went rigid, it was Charlotte who knelt without a thought to help him gather the pieces. And the story of it went around London by morning, and the ton did not know whether to be scandalized or enchanted, and settled, as London always does, on enchanted. Only one shadow moved at the edge of all this light. His name was Henry, and he was the Earl of Marlowe's only son. 40 years old, unmarried, gentle-voiced, with his father's gray eyes and none of his father's fire. He was kind to Charlotte. He was attentive. He turned her music pages and remembered that she disliked lilies, and one evening the old Earl took her hand and said, with the terrible hope of an old man, "My dear, nothing would close my account with your father so completely as to call you my daughter-in-law before I die." Charlotte had smiled and said nothing, and lain awake that night staring at the ceiling. Because Henry was good, Henry was safe, Henry was everything a sensible woman should want. And when Charlotte closed her eyes, the face she saw was none of his. It was a man standing alone at the far edge of a garden by an old sundial, with his back to a house he was about to lose, watching her carriage until it was long out of sight, and then a while more. She hated that she saw it anyway. 90 miles away, Ravenscourt was dying. The auction had been set for September. The lawyers came and went like crows. The paintings were catalogued, the silver was crated, the horses were sold, and through it all the Duke of Ravenscourt lived alone in 12 shrouded rooms with a skeleton staff of 4, because he had written to every servant's new employer himself, letter after letter of references, and sent them off to better houses before the ship went down. Mr. Godwin refused to go. "I came with the house, your grace," the old man said. "I will lock it." It was Godwin who found him, on a wet night in August, in the late Duke's private study, a room Nathaniel had avoided for months, sorting his dead uncle's papers by candlelight because the lawyers required it. That was where he found the drawer. The bottom drawer of the old desk was locked, and no key on the ring would open it, and a weaker man, or a wiser one, would have left it for the auctioneers. Nathaniel pried it open with a letter knife at 2 in the morning. Inside there were 3 things. The first was a bundle of receipts, decades old, for payments made quietly, year after year, to a school in the north, then to a lodging house, then to a physician. Payments for the care of Mrs. Hale, widow, and her daughter. The old Duke had found them then, long before Charlotte ever came to Ravenscourt. He had been the invisible hand keeping them alive, and had never said a word to anyone. The second was a letter, unsealed in the old Duke's writing, addressed to my nephew Nathaniel, and it said in part, "You will wonder why I took the girl in and told no one who she was. Because 12 great men swore an oath about Edward Hale, and I did not trust great men to keep it, and I did not want her raised as a debt. I wanted her raised as a person. Perhaps I was wrong. I was wrong about many things, but watch her, Nathaniel, when she does not know she is watched. Then you will understand. There is more noble blood in that girl than in every drawing room in London, and I include our own." And the third thing was a legal document drawn up in a lawyer's fair hand, dated 11 days before the old Duke's death, a codicil to his will. It directed that 1/2 of the unentailed fortune of the estate, the money, the investments, the London property, everything that was not locked to the title, be settled absolutely upon Miss Charlotte Hale, ward, in recognition of a debt of honor owed to her late father, who once, the document said simply, saved the life of someone I loved. At the bottom, above the waiting line for his name, the space was blank. He had died in his sleep 11 days too soon. Nathaniel sat in the cold study with the candle burning down, and did the arithmetic that Diana Fenwick would have done in a heartbeat. Unsigned, the codicil was legally nothing. Waste paper. No court would enforce it, no lawyer even needed to see it. But announced, acknowledged, honored, it would consume every unentailed penny that was left. The pennies that were meant to satisfy the creditors, the pennies that were the last thin plank between himself and absolute ruin. Honoring it would not just cost him the estate. The estate was already lost. It would cost him the small, salvaged remainder that a man could have lived on quietly abroad. It would leave him with the title, the debts, and the clothes he stood in. And no one would ever know. That was the thing, that was the whisper of it. Godwin had not seen the drawer. The lawyers had no record, he checked, the codicil had never been filed. 1 paper, 1 candle flame, 3 seconds. The fire was right there in the grate. The Duke of Ravenscourt sat with the codicil in one hand and looked at the fire for a long time. Then he stood, went to the door, and called down the dark stairs for Godwin. The old butler came up in his nightcap with a lamp. "Pack a small case," Nathaniel said. His face was strange, Godwin thought, not despairing, clear. The face of a man who has been lost in a wood for a long time and has, finally, on the worst night, found the road. "We leave for London in the morning." "London, your grace. What is in London?" The Duke looked down at the paper in his hand, at the blank space where a dead man's signature should have been, at the one thing in England that had no legal power whatsoever, and every other kind. "A debt," he said. The invitation had gone out weeks before, and all London had schemed for a card. The Earl of Marlowe's grand dinner at Grosvenor Square, 40 guests, in honor of Miss Charlotte Hale. The 12 lords would all attend. It was to be, everyone said, the crowning night of the season. No one had invited the Duke of Ravenscourt. He came anyway. The dinner had just ended, and the party had moved to the great drawing room when the murmur started at the door and spread and became a silence. Charlotte turned from the fireplace, and there he stood in the doorway, travel-worn, thinner than she remembered, in a black coat that had seen better years, holding a leather folder in one hand like a man holding his own sentence. Beside him, of all people, stood Mr. Godwin, scrubbed and terrified in his 40-year-old best suit. 2 footmen moved to block the way. The Duke of Weston rose from his chair like a siege engine. "You have considerable nerve, sir." "Yes," the Duke of Ravenscourt said quietly. "It is nearly all I have left. 5 minutes, your grace. Before witnesses, which is how I want it. Then I will go, and you may set the dogs on me with my blessing." Old Marlowe studied him for a long moment from his chair, and something in the younger man's face made him lift 2 fingers, and the footman stepped back. "5 minutes," the Earl said, "for the curiosity of it." The Duke walked into the center of the room, into that circle of silk and candlelight and 40 hostile stares. He did not look at any of them. He looked at Charlotte once briefly, the way a man looks at the shore from a sinking ship, and then he opened the folder. 3 weeks ago, sorting my late uncle's papers for the auction, I found a locked drawer. His voice was steady, formal, and stripped of everything but the facts. "I am going to read you what was in it." And he did, all of it. The receipts first, the quiet decades of payments to a school, a lodging house, a physician, and the room began to shift as 40 people understood what they were hearing, that the old Duke had found Hale's widow when 12 great lords with all their hired men could not, and had said nothing, and asked nothing. Old Marlowe leaned slowly forward in his chair with his hand over his mouth. Then the letter. "Watch her, Nathaniel, when she does not know she is watched. Then you will understand." Charlotte stood frozen at the fireplace with her hand pressed flat against her heart. And then the codicil. He read it in the same level voice. Half of everything unentailed settled absolutely upon Miss Charlotte Hale in recognition of a debt of honor owed to her late father, who once saved the life of someone I loved. He read the date, 11 days before death, and then he stopped. "There is no signature," the Duke said. "He died before he could sign it. My lawyers inform me, and Lord Renfield will confirm, that this paper is therefore worth nothing at all. It binds no one. No court in England will look at it." He closed the folder. "There was a fire burning 3 feet from me when I found it, and I want to be honest with this company. I considered it, for longer than a good man would have." The silence in the room was total. "My uncle was the best man I ever knew, and this paper is the last thing he wanted on this earth, and I find I would rather be ruined than be the man who burned it." He drew out a second document and laid it on the table before Marlowe. "This is a deed of settlement, executed before witnesses yesterday. It transfers to Miss Hale 1/2 of every unentailed asset remaining to me, effective immediately. Lord Renfield's bank will discover that the sum makes my remaining debts unpayable. I am aware of that. The auction of Ravenscourt will now cover the creditors and nothing more. I sail for the continent within the month." He looked up at last and found Charlotte's eyes across the room, and for the first time his voice was not steady. "Miss Hale, I did not write that advertisement. I signed a paper without reading it, and I have no proof of more, and I will accuse no one without proof, so that is all I will ever say of it. But what happened to you happened in my house under my name, and a man is answerable for his name. My uncle asked me to watch you and understand. I did not listen in time. I understand now." He bowed to her deeply, the way the 12 lords had bowed. "This settles his debt. Mine, I know, cannot be settled. I will not trouble you again." He straightened, nodded once to old Marlowe, said, "Thank you for the 5 minutes, my lord," and walked out of the drawing room through the hall, past 40 speechless members of the finest society in England, with Mr. Godwin trotting behind him, and the great front door closed, and he was gone. For a long moment, nobody in the drawing room moved. Then the Marquis of Ashford, the coldest man in London, said slowly, to no one in particular, "Gentlemen, I begin to think we may have hanged the wrong man." Charlotte did not hear him. She was already moving through the drawing room into the hall, her heart pounding with something that had no name yet, or a name she had refused to say. She pulled open the great door herself before the footman could reach it, and looked out into the dark square. The street was empty, rain, lamplight, and no one. He was gone. And it was there, standing in the open doorway with the rain blowing in, that a soft voice spoke behind her. "What a very handsome performance," said Lady Diana Fenwick. Charlotte turned. Diana stood in the lamplight of the hall, beautiful, perfectly composed, a glass of champagne in one gloved hand. She had arrived in London 2 weeks ago. She had, it appeared, secured an invitation. Diana always secured invitations. "Miss Hale," she said warmly, and her smile was flawless and her eyes were not. "How wonderful to see you looking so grand. We are all so proud." She took a small sip. "Do be careful, though, my dear. You have inherited a fortune tonight, and I promise you, no man alive gives away half of everything without first calculating how to get back the whole." She laid one gloved hand gently, kindly on Charlotte's arm. "But you are clever. You will work that out for yourself. After all," and here her voice dropped, sweet as syrup, cold as the rain outside, "you must have wondered why he chose to do it so very publicly." And with that, Diana glided back toward the drawing room and the candlelight, leaving Charlotte alone in the doorway between the warm house and the dark street, with a fortune she had never asked for, a doubt she had never had until this moment, and the rain coming down on an empty square. The poison had been planted. It would take root by morning. Doubt is a patient gardener. Diana's whisper had been planted on a rainy doorstep, and for 3 days Charlotte pulled it up by the roots every morning, and every night it grew back. Because that is the cruelty of a clever lie. It does not ask to be believed. It only asks to be considered. Why so publicly? Why before 40 witnesses and every newspaper in London? She fought it. She remembered a man trying to buy every newspaper in a village, 1 hour too late. She remembered a face at the far end of a garden. But she had also learned in 11 hard years exactly how much her own judgment of the mighty was worth, and the lesson underneath all the other lessons of her life was this: the people who smile at you are calculating something. It was the one lesson she desperately wanted to unlearn. Diana knew that. Diana had lived in the same house with her for 3 months, and hatred is a form of study. The letter arrived on the 4th day. It came in the afternoon post, addressed in an unfamiliar hand with no sender's name. Inside was a single sheet, and the writing on it made Charlotte's blood stop because she knew it. She had seen it on ledgers and instructions for months at Ravenscourt. The Duke's hand, strong, slanted, unmistakable. It was a fragment, torn neatly along one edge, as if rescued from a fire or a wastebasket, and it read: "You ask whether I have considered the sum. I have considered nothing else. Understand me, the settlement is not a loss but a seed. Publicly done, it buys back my name, and a restored name may then recover everything twice over by the oldest road there is. She is the road. Marriage restores the whole, and I am told she is not indifferent to me, which will make the thing simple enough to." The fragment ended there, mid-sentence torn. At the bottom of the page, in a different, small, careful hand, someone had written, "Miss Hale, a friend thought you deserved the truth. Ask him, if you doubt this, why a ruined man's lawyers were drawing settlement papers with such haste. What creditor rushes to be poor?" Charlotte sat with the letter in her lap for 1 hour, in a bright room full of flowers that admirers had sent, and did not move. It was a forgery, we know that. Diana had spent 3 weeks on it, working from a memorandum of the Duke's she had kept, practicing his hand the way she had once practiced a steward's, and it was the finest work of her life. But Charlotte was not us. Charlotte was a woman who had been sold in a newspaper by people she lived with, and here, in ink in his own hand, was the exact shape of her oldest fear. That kindness was always, always arithmetic. The road is she. Marriage restores the whole. She did not weep. That was the worst of it, Marlowe's housekeeper said later. She went silent instead, the old silence, the servant's silence, the one she had brought from Ravenscourt, and something that had been slowly opening in her all season closed like a door. That evening Henry found her in the library, and gentle Henry, who deserved better than his moment, chose it badly. "You seem far away tonight, Miss Hale." "I am deciding something, my lord." "Might I know what?" Charlotte looked at the fire. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly calm and about 200 years old. "Whether it is wiser to be loved for a fortune honestly by a man who says so, or dishonestly by a man who says otherwise." She turned to him. "My lord, you once did me the honor of a certain question. If you were to ask it again, I believe you would receive a different answer." Henry asked it again. The engagement of Lord Henry Marlowe to Miss Charlotte Hale was announced 10 days later, and London sighed with satisfaction because it made such a tidy ending. The hero's daughter and the great Earl's heir. The old Earl wept with joy and ordered the chapel dressed. The 12 lords sent gifts. The papers called it the wedding of the age. The news reached Nathaniel in a dockside inn at Dover, where he was waiting out a week of contrary winds. His passage to Lisbon booked, his worldly goods reduced to 2 trunks, and Mr. Godwin, who had flatly refused every arranged position and announced that he was, at 68, emigrating. Godwin brought him the newspaper with the announcement in it, and watched his master read it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Nathaniel read it twice. Then he folded the paper with great care, set it down, and said, in a voice Godwin never forgot, "Good, that is a good house. She will be safe in it." Then he went out and walked on the gray beach until dark. That night alone, he did the last accounting. Ravenscourt would be auctioned on the 29th of September. The lawyers no longer needed him even for that. The creditors would take everything, and the title would go on without a house under it, a crown without a head. In his trunk at the very bottom lay the one thing he had kept that the lawyers would have called an asset, his uncle's chess set, the one the old man had beaten Godwin with in under an hour, on the 9th of December in the last winter of his life. He had meant, someday, in some impossible future, to tell Charlotte that he had kept it, and why. He understood now that the telling would never happen, and that this was the correct price for a signature given blindly, and he accepted it the way he had learned that autumn to accept things completely and without anesthetic. 200 miles apart, on the same night, 2 people sat awake. In Dover, a ruined man watched the harbor lights and waited for a wind to take him away from England. In London, in a great house full of wedding silk, a bride sat at her window with a torn letter in a locked drawer, telling herself firmly, the way one tells a child, that she had chosen safety and honesty and peace. Telling herself that the ache under her ribs was only tiredness. Telling herself she had not believed the whole of the letter anyway, and that it did not matter, and that it changed nothing because whatever the truth was, he was leaving and she was promised, and it was done. The wedding was set for the 2nd of October. The auction of Ravenscourt was set for the 29th of September. And in a printer's shop 90 miles from London, in a locked cabinet where a careful tradesman kept things that frightened him, lay a work order from the previous spring, one sheet among hundreds, bearing an addition in a hand that did not match the rest, a hand that was about to bring the whole beautiful lie down. 3 days, 3 pieces of paper, one old butler who could not sleep. That is where we go next. Mr. Godwin had served great houses for 50 years, and he had learned their first commandment in his first week as a boot boy. A good servant sees everything and says nothing. He had kept that commandment his whole life. He had kept it through 3 weeks of watching his ruined master stare at the sea at Dover, and on the 5th night, lying awake in a dockside inn, listening to the wind that would soon carry the last Duke of Ravenscourt away forever, Mr. Godwin sat up in the dark and said aloud to no one, "No." Because a good servant sees everything, and Godwin had seen. He had spent months adding it up, in the servant's arithmetic that great folk never suspect. He had seen Diana take the letters those first days and come away pale. He had seen a burned page in her bedroom grate, a corner of heavy paper with a Viscount's seal when he cleaned the ashes. He had seen, months before that, on the night of the London Messenger, the sale list lying on the study desk, and Diana bending over it with a pen before she carried it to the Duke, and he had thought nothing of it, because a lady may check a list. And he had stood in the hall at Grosvenor Square and watched Diana Fenwick glide out to the doorstep after Charlotte, and glide back in with the particular serenity she wore. He had learned in 3 months of serving her, only when she had broken something. Seen everything, said nothing, and 2 good people were about to be destroyed by his silence. At dawn he left a note for the Duke saying he had gone to settle a private debt, took his life's savings from the lining of his trunk, and boarded the coach north. He did not go to London. He went to the printers. The owner of the County Herald was a careful man named Tibbs, and careful men keep records. When the old butler of Ravenscourt appeared in his shop and asked, quietly, to see the original work order for a certain advertisement from the spring, Mr. Tibbs went grey. "I wondered when someone would come," he said. "I have kept it locked away since the week it printed. Look at it yourself, Mr. Godwin. The whole order is in Steward Pratt's hand, same as every season for 20 years, all but 1 line." He laid the sheet on the counter and set a lamp beside it. The 3rd item, written between the others in a hand copying his and copying it well. But a printer knows hands the way a shepherd knows sheep. The loops are wrong. The ink is wrong. And there is one letter that the writer forgot to disguise. He set beside it a second paper, a note that had accompanied payment, signed by the sender of the order's correction that had come 2 days after, insisting the wording stand exactly as written. The capital D, Mr. Godwin. Look at the capital D in obedient corrected there, and the capital D in this signature. Lady Diana Fenwick writes her D like a sail in the wind. She could not unlearn it. Godwin looked at the 2 letters side by side in the lamplight for a long time. "Mr. Tibbs, will you swear to this before witnesses?" The printer took a slow breath. "My trade lives on the goodwill of the great, Mr. Godwin. If I speak against an earl's daughter, I may be ruined." He looked down at the advertisement that had made his newspaper famous and his conscience sick. "But my father took this shop's first order 60 years ago from old Captain Hale's father, so yes, I will swear." They reached London on the 27th of September, 2 old men in a hired coach, 5 days before a wedding. Charlotte received them in the small morning room because Godwin had sent up a note saying only, "Miss Hale, it concerns the 3rd item on a certain list, 5 minutes, G." She came in pale and stood very straight, and Godwin, who had blocked her way on a staircase once before, did not waste one of his 5 minutes. "Miss Hale, His Grace never wrote that advertisement. Here is the printer's original order. Here is Mr. Tibbs, who kept it, come to swear to it. The line that sold you was added by Lady Diana Fenwick in a copied hand, on the night she put a sale list in front of a frightened, half-ruined man and told him not to trouble himself reading it." The old man's voice shook, but it did not stop. "And there is more, and it shames me to say it took a printer's capital D to make me certain of what I have suspected in my bones for half a year. Whatever paper turned you against him, miss, and I ask nothing about it, look at it again. Because I have now seen what her hand can do, and I am telling you, that woman could forge the Book of Psalms." The room was silent. Charlotte looked at the work order, at the 3rd line crowded neatly between the plow and the cow, at the alien loops swimming in another man's handwriting. Then she walked to her desk, unlocked the drawer, and laid the torn letter beside the printer's sheet. Mr. Tibbs leaned over both with his spectacles down, in the manner of a man doing the one thing on earth he truly knows. It took him less than a minute. "Same hand," he said flatly. "Same pen cut, I should say. And the tear is wrong, Miss Torn, after writing deliberately through the middle of a sentence built to be torn through. No one writes to the edge of a page like that. This was never part of any letter. It was made to be a fragment." He straightened. "It is not only a forgery, Miss Hale, it is a stage prop." Charlotte stood with her hand flat on the 2 papers, and what happened in her face then, Godwin said afterward, he would not try to put into words, except that it was like watching ice go out of a river. Every piece of it fell at once. The advertisement, the whisper on the doorstep, the letter arriving 4 days later, exactly when the doubt was ripest. She had been played like an instrument by someone who had studied her for months, and the man who had actually done nothing but sign a page blind had taken the whole weight of it in silence, and given away half of everything, and called her safe in another man's house, and gone to wait for a ship. "Mr. Godwin," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very clear. "Where is he?" "Dover, miss, the wind came fair yesterday. The Lisbon packet sails on the morning tide, the 29th. "The 29th, Charlotte said slowly, "is the auction." And it was in that moment, between one heartbeat and the next, that the plan arrived, whole, the way lightning arrives, and something that had been 11 years asleep in Charlotte Hale woke up entirely. But there was one door she had to walk through first, and she went that evening, alone, and knocked on it. Henry listened to all of it. She spared herself nothing, showed him the forged letter, told him what she had believed and why she had said yes, and offered him the truth she owed, that he was the best of men and that she had accepted him with a divided heart, and that a divided heart was an insult he did not deserve. Henry was quiet for a while. Then he did the finest thing of his quiet life. He took her hand, kissed it once like a brother, and said, "Miss Hale, I have watched you all season. You look at me the way one looks at a warm fire. You looked at that ruined man in my father's drawing room for 1/2 of 1 second, the way my mother used to look at my father when his carriage turned into the square. I would rather be unmarried than spend my life as somebody's warm fire." He smiled a little. "Go before the tide does, and leave my father to me. He will roar, and then he will cry, and then he will call for his carriage and follow you, because he has waited 23 years to see Hale's daughter happy, and by God, so have I." The 29th of September came up cold and bright over Ravenscourt. They held the auction on the south lawn under a striped canvas, and half the county came, some to buy and more to watch, because there is no theater like a great house dying. The auctioneer worked through the morning. The paintings went. The silver went. And at noon, as advertised, came the estate itself, house, park, farms, the whole of Ravenscourt in one lot, and the tent went quiet. The bidding opened. A wool magnate from Leeds, a syndicate lawyer from London buying for someone nameless. Back and forth, up and up, past the creditor's floor, and the auctioneer's voice rolled on, and the lawyer nodded again, and the hammer rose for the final call. "Going twice, then, gentlemen, at 94,000. 110,000 pounds, said a clear voice from the back of the tent. Every head turned. She had come straight from the road, still in her traveling cloak, mud on its hem, Godwin at one shoulder and a lawyer of the Marlowe house at the other. And behind them, arriving even then across the lawn like weather, old Marlowe himself and Weston and Ashford, and one by one, the 12. "The bid," said the Marlowe lawyer into the ringing silence, "is entered on behalf of Miss Charlotte Hale, and is backed, should anyone wish to test it, by the signatures in this letter, which I am instructed to say include every gentleman now standing at the back of this tent." No one wished to test it. The hammer came down on the third stroke like a church bell, and the auctioneer, hoarse with history, said the words the county would repeat for 50 years. "Sold, Ravenscourt entire, to Miss Charlotte Hale." The woman who had been listed for sale between a plow and a milk cow had just bought the house that sold her. With the fortune, a ruined man had given away to keep a dead man's promise. But she was not looking at the house. She was scanning the crowd, the lawn, the windows, with rising fear, because the one face she had crossed England for was nowhere in it, and Godwin was already pulling out his watch, and his own face was falling. "The tide missed the morning tide. The packet sailed at 6. He is not here, he is at sea." The lawn, the tent, the murmuring crowd, all of it went far away. Charlotte stood on the grass of her own estate, 1 hour too late, and understood exactly how a man had felt once riding into a village after the post coaches had gone. "No," she said. "No, not by one tide, not after all this. Someone find me." "Miss Hale," said Mr. Tibbs the printer gently at her elbow, and he was holding out a folded newspaper, that morning's Herald, damp from the press. "Before you send to Dover, my boy set this notice last evening, paid for in coin by a gentleman's man. I thought nothing of it until I saw you bid. Read the third item." She unfolded it with unsteady hands. It was the shipping and sales column. 1 plow sold. 1 milk cow sold. And there, third in small print between the notices, exactly where a certain line had once been placed to break her. "Not for sale and never was. The honor of a lady wronged in these pages last spring. The undersigned, having missed his ship on purpose, will wait at the old sundial until she has read this, however long that is. He is informed the plow and the cow found good homes. He asks nothing, expects nothing, and apologizes for the walk. R." She ran. In front of the whole county, in front of 12 lords and the ghost of every rule she had ever been taught, Charlotte Hale picked up her skirts and ran through the gardens of her own estate, past the yew hedge, past the roses gone wild all summer, down the long walk where she had carried trays for 11 years. And there, at the far edge of the garden, by the old sundial, stood a man in a black coat with 2 trunks at his feet and the morning sun on his face, watching her come, perfectly still. The way he had once stood watching a carriage go. She stopped 3 feet from him, out of breath, mud to her knees, 100 things colliding in her throat, and what came out first, absurdly, was, "You missed your ship." "I stood on the dock," the Duke said, "and I found I could not leave England while you thought that letter was mine. Godwin's note reached me at midnight. Tibbs's boy did the rest." He paused. "I hear you have bought a house." "I have. It came with everything." She lifted her chin, and 11 years of silence ended in the oldest words she knew, turned inside out and made new. "But the inventory is short 1 item, your grace. The estate appears to lack a duke. I am told they are expensive to keep, prone to signing things unread, and inclined to stand at the edges of gardens." Her voice broke and did not care. "Name your price." The Duke of Ravenscourt looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and took out a small, worn wooden box and opened it, and inside was no ring, but a chess piece, a white queen, from a set an old man had once played on a 9th of December. "Everything I have," he said, "is a debt to your father, a chess set, and the rest of my life. The price is all 3 taken together." And then at the old sundial in the garden where it had begun, he went down on 1 knee. "Charlotte, I have no right to ask. I am asking." "Then I am answering," she said, and gave him her hand. And the county, which had crept after her through the gardens to a man, woman, and child, sent up a roar they heard in the village. And somewhere at the back of it old Marlowe was weeping shamelessly into Weston's enormous shoulder, saying, look at them, Hale, you stubborn ghost, look what your girl has done." As for Lady Diana Fenwick, the evidence went before the 12 that same week. The work order, the payment note, the sails in the wind capital D, the stage prop letter, and Mr. Tibbs swore to all of it, and was never once troubled in his trade afterward, being under the declared protection of a dozen great houses for life. There was no trial. There are worse courts. The 12 lords simply let it be known, quietly, completely, in the way such men can, what she had done and how she had done it, and London closed against Diana Fenwick like a frozen sea. The invitations stopped. The engagements dissolved. Her own father, mortified past bearing, packed her to a distant aunt in the far north, where she lived out her days in a cold stone house, rich, beautiful, and utterly unvisited, with nothing to study but the moor and no one left to break. They say she never once spoke Charlotte's name again. They say, in the north, that on the day the wedding was reported in the papers, she was seen at her window for a long time looking south. The bells of Ravenscourt village rang on the 2nd of October after all. The wedding was moved, not cancelled, and if you had stood in the crowd outside the little church, you would have seen 12 of the most powerful men in England waiting bareheaded in the autumn sun to see a bride walk in on old Marlowe's arm, and a groom at the altar with a white queen in his waistcoat pocket. and behind the last pew, in his 40-year-old best suit, an old butler who had finally, after a lifetime, seen everything and said something. But the morning after the wedding, and the frame that hangs to this day in the study, and the 12 men around a christening cradle, and what became of a certain cow and a certain plow, all that belongs to the epilogue. And it is waiting for us. 1 year later, the first thing the new Duchess of Ravenscourt did as mistress of the house was throw open every window in it. It was the morning after the wedding, and the staff, most of whom had been quietly bought back from their new employers over the preceding week by a Marlowe lawyer with a list and a smile, gathered in the great hall to be presented to her Grace, and found her Grace already in the kitchens, in a plain morning dress, asking the cook whether the range still smoked on wet days, and whether her niece had recovered from the whooping cough. The cook burst into tears. So the first order ever given by the Duchess of Ravenscourt was for 2 chairs and a fresh pot of tea, and the second was that in this house, from this day, no one would ever again eat standing up. The second thing she did caused an argument. The only one the servants insisted for years afterward that the Duke and Duchess ever truly had. She sent to Mr. Tibbs for a copy of a certain edition of the County Herald from the previous spring. She had it framed in plain oak, and she hung it in the study, on the wall directly facing the desk, where no one who worked in that room could fail to see it 100 times a day. The Duke came in, saw it, and went white. "Take it down," he said. "Charlotte, please, of all the things to keep." "No. I cannot sit in this room with that on the wall. It is the worst thing I have ever put my name to." "And it is the best thing that ever happened to me," she said, and stood beside the frame, and put her finger gently on the small, cruel line of print between the plow and the cow. "Nathaniel, listen to me, because I will say this once, and then we will drink our tea and never quarrel again. For 23 years, 12 of the most powerful men in England searched for me and could not find me. My father could not reach me. He was dead, and the dead cannot write letters. And then one spring morning, a wicked woman, meaning to destroy me, printed my name where all of England would read it." She looked up at him. "That advertisement is the only letter my father ever sent me. It took 23 years to arrive, and it was written by his enemy's hand, and it brought me 12 guardians, a fortune, this house, and you. I will not burn my father's letter, your Grace. It hangs where I can see it." The Duke of Ravenscourt looked at his wife for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and kissed her brow, and never spoke of taking it down again. Though the servants noticed over the years a curious thing. Whenever a visitor asked about the strange framed newspaper, his Grace would answer before the Duchess could, and always in the same words, spoken quietly and without shame. "That is the record of the greatest wrong ever done in this house, madam, and of the woman who answered it with the greatest mercy. We keep it as the Bible keeps its worst chapters, so that no one forgets and no one repeats them." The debts were cleared by Christmas. This was a matter of some entertainment to the lawyers because it was done backwards. The Duchess held the estate, the Duke held nothing but the title and, as he had put it at the sundial, the rest of his life. He refused flatly to touch a penny of her fortune for his old obligations. So through the autumn the county was treated to the sight of a Duke rising at 5, riding the farms like a steward, renegotiating leases, draining the low fields, selling his London tailors' addresses to younger fools, and paying down his notes shilling by earned shilling, until Lord Renfield himself, receiving the final payment in his bank on the 23rd of December, was heard to remark that in 40 years of finance he had seen many men ruined by marriage. And this was the first he had ever seen redeemed by one, and that he was thinking of writing a paper on it. The 12 lords came back in the spring. They came for the christening. A daughter born in April with gray eyes, a stubborn chin and lungs, the Duke of Weston declared reverently, of solid regimental brass. She was named Edwina Hale, and there was no argument in the county about who she was named for, and there could not be a private christening because, as old Marlowe wrote in his letter of acceptance. "You will forgive us, my dear, but we have waited a quarter of a century for this family to begin again, and you shall not cheat us of it." So they came, all 12, and filled the little village church to its stone walls. And after the service, before the whole congregation, there occurred the scene that the vicar recorded that same evening in the parish book, in a hand that trembled slightly, so that those who come after will know it truly happened. The 12 lords of England formed a line at the font, in order of age, old Marlowe first and Lord Julian Weymouth last. And one by one, each man came to the cradle, and bowed to the sleeping child as low as he had once bowed to her mother, and laid one hand on the cradle's edge, and said the same words, passed down the line like a watchword on a cold night. "For your grandfather's sake, as long as I draw breath." 12 times. The vicar wrote that by the 4th repetition there was open weeping in the pews, and that Mr. Godwin, seated in a place of honor beside the family, wept straight through all 12 like a leaking roof, and made no attempt upon his dignity whatsoever. Lord Julian was last. He stood over the cradle the longest, and those nearest heard him add very quietly when his turn came, "Your grandfather carried me a mile when I was worth nothing, little one. Between the 12 of us we shall manage yours." Edwina Hale slept magnificently through the entire ceremony, and woke only at the end and did not cry, but regarded the 12 most powerful faces in England with grave grey eyes, one after another, as if taking attendance. Henry Marlowe stood godfather. He had arrived 2 days early, kissed the Duchess's hand like a brother, shaken the Duke's hand like a friend, and spent the whole visit teaching the head groom's children to fish. At the christening luncheon he rose, glass in hand, and gave the toast that was repeated in every drawing-room in London within the fortnight. "To her Grace, who refused me for the best reason a man can be refused. To his Grace, who is the reason. And to my own future wife, whoever and wherever she may be, with this promise before witnesses. I shall know her at once, gentlemen, for she will look at me the way a woman looks at a burning building, and not the way she looks at a warm fire." He found her, too, in time, a naval officer's widow, penniless and proud, who could not have cared less about Marlowe money and who looked at Henry. Old Marlowe grumbled happily, like a house entirely lost to the flames. But that is another story. As for the great houses of the county, they learned the new order of things quickly. Invitations to Ravenscourt became the most desired in 3 counties, and the most peculiar, because rank at her Grace's table meant nothing and character meant everything, and more than one baronet found himself seated below a retired schoolmistress and dared not say a word about it. The scullery maid who had wept over a newspaper was now head of the still-room, and engaged to the printer's boy from the Herald, whose wedding gift from the Duchess was the freehold of a shop of his own. Steward Pratt, whose honest handwriting had been stolen for the crime, was pensioned like an admiral, and Mr. Tibbs the printer dined at the great house every quarter day until the end of his life, seated always at the Duchess's right hand, and when his grandchildren asked him why, he would only tap the side of his nose and say, "Capital D, my dears, capital D." Of Diana Fenwick, Ravenscourt heard almost nothing, which was itself the sentence. Almost nothing. Once a year every spring, on the anniversary of a certain edition of the County Herald, a letter arrived at the cold stone house in the north. It contained no reproach and no news. It contained, each year, a single banknote, generous, anonymous, and unmistakable, and a card printed with one line, "For the woman who delivered my father's letter, paid in full with interest as is the custom of this family." They say she burned the first one. They say she kept the rest. They say that is the cruelest mercy there is, to be forgiven completely by the person you tried to destroy, and to have the receipt arrive annually. Mr. Godwin never retired. It was discussed. It was even once gently proposed with a cottage and a pension attached. The old man listened courteously, thanked their graces, observed that the silver would not survive a week without supervision and remained. He lived to be 91. He carried Edwina on his shoulders through the gallery and taught her the name of every ancestor on the walls, including, in its place of honor, the small portrait of a captain of infantry that hung now among the dukes and duchesses. Outranking, Godwin told the child solemnly, every last one of them. He taught her brother, born 2 years later, to polish boots properly, on the grounds that no gentleman should command what he cannot do. And when he died at last in his sleep, in the house he had refused to leave, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscourt walked behind his coffin as chief mourners, and the 12 lords sent 12 wreaths, and the stone above him, which stands in the village churchyard to this day, was worded by the Duchess herself. Josiah Godwin, 50 years a servant of this house, he saw everything, and when it mattered he spoke. In the cow in the plow. The cow was traced within the month, that first autumn. She had been bought at the original sale by a smallholder 2 villages over, a bewildered and honest man who was visited one morning by the Duchess of Ravenscourt in person, and who refused absolutely to sell her back at any price until her grace explained who she was and what the cow was, at which point he refused absolutely to accept any payment at all, and a compromise was reached involving a new barn. The cow, a placid brown creature of no distinction whatsoever, was walked home to Ravenscourt with ribbons on her horns by half the children of the parish, and installed in the south meadow, the one visible from the study window, where she grew old and enormous and outrageously spoiled, and was never milked again in her life, and was known to 3 generations of the family, the staff, the county, and eventually the readers of 2 London newspapers, simply and officially as Duchess. The plow took longer. It was found rusting in a barn at the far end of the county, bought back for a shilling, and the Duke, who by then could laugh about almost all of it, proposed melting it down. His wife overruled him, as she occasionally did, and had it set instead in the rose garden by the old sundial, where the climbing roses were trained up its handles, and where it stands yet, so covered in bloom by every June that visitors must be told there is a plow in there at all. There is a small brass plate at its base. Most visitors miss it. It reads, "Sold once in poor condition, alongside the 2 most valuable items this estate ever owned. All 3 came home." On summer evenings, when the light goes long and gold across the south lawn, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscourt walk out together after dinner, past the meadow where an ancient cow dozes in shameless comfort, down the walk where a girl once carried trays in silence, to the sundial and the roses and the plow. The children run ahead. The house glows behind them with every window lit. And if you asked her on such an evening whether she ever thinks of that cold Tuesday morning in the kitchen, the newspaper, the shame, the crying scullery maid, the longest week of her life, the Duchess would tell you what she once told her daughter on the child's 10th birthday, standing before an old framed advertisement in the study. I think of it whenever I am tempted to believe that a bad day is the end of the story. Nothing is wasted, little one. Not sorrow, not patience, not 11 years of silence, not even wickedness. God writes very strangely, but he writes straight. I was listed between a plow and a cow, and it turned out to be the finest company I ever kept. They meant it as my price. She would smile then, the Duchess of Ravenscourt, and touch the frame, once, the way one touches a father's hand. It became my proof of worth instead. The whole of England answered, and do you know, my darling, in 340 letters, not one of them ever asked about the plow.